Maybe I'll start things up. Okay. It's really great to be here, and actually it was really wonderful to see it on the big screen instead of on my computer and on my phone and on my laptop, all the various ways in which I watched it before. Thank you so much for sharing the film with us and for giving us the opportunity to speak with you about it. So one of the things that was super striking to me, and that took a little digging on my part, as somebody who works in the Caribbean and works on the kind of legacies and afterlives of imperialism, is the imperial story that you're telling, which has a massively longer timeline than the one with which I'm familiar, which is a 500-year story, right? And so what you're tracking, or what I see you tracking anyway, is this sort of historical series of interventions, invasions, conscriptions, boundary making, extractions, and you're tying the story of these kind of palimpsestic imperial projects to the story of the climactic shifts and the climate change story that you're telling. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you see those two phenomena as continuous, and also, how you see these multiple imperial moments as dynamic, but perhaps also of kind of the same piece.
First of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you Jessica and Bridget and Heather for having us, and for you too as well. So yeah, it's interesting that in the question there's like somehow a parallel between imperialism and the Iron Age of the Phoenician history, because the story of Dido happens in the Iron Age, and so she flew from Tyre because of like a power struggle, let's say, and then seeking a ground where she can live, or like dwell, let's say, with the people that moved with her. And then what was inspiring for us is this idea of this intuitive approach to land and territory that is very much against this extractivist, colonial approach to engaging with land and these kind of things, but also how like the specificity of the place, because in the south of Tunisia, where the desert that you see, where the Shat al-Jarid is, it was imagined in colonial times also by Roder to be flooded with the Mediterranean. So this idea of replicating a geological event that happened millions of years ago of increasing the salinity level of the Mediterranean because of the water flow stopping from flowing into it through like Strait of Gibraltar. So this idea of being inspired by an ecological crisis and then wanting to have this fantasy of replicating it as a way of understanding land and territory very much from an extractivist, value-driven perspective. So like the intention of starting, let's say, or like within the golden, let's say, castle that you see at the beginning of the film, we have the year stating where we are, where the film starts after we see the Dido Problem starting in the present day of Tunisia and the Medina. And that was an intention of not necessarily looking at time as a linear thread, but also like trying to unfold how like the cultural and material configurations of time, and how time could maybe be seen as a from that perspective of its materialistic thing that affords forms of ruptures and surprises, and also allows for an understanding of a future that is generative, or like can co-produce itself with people and other forms of lives. And also, like when I was flying to here, actually, because I had a very long flight with I didn't want to read a book or watch anything, and I was thinking about like the present day moment, let's say, and this idea of like the culture of narcissism, or like this hyper individualized thing, like when thinking about time specifically, and how like when living in times where the past is reduced to nostalgia, and there are very little expectations for a different future possibility. How can time be seen, and then how time how this culture creates this idea of impatience because of the loss of connection to this cyclical, rhythmic time. And then I think these were also the things that very much shaped our our engagement with its temporal logic within the narrative.
And it's interesting what you said about people in your comments just now. So you're talking about Dido, and she brought people with her, of course, and then you said something about a relationship to land that is not extractive, but actually is built by people collectively, etc. But there are so few people in the film, actually. There's the belly dancer, there's the runner at the end, and there are the people in the market in the beginning, and that's it.
And when she arrives to the land, the one with the white.
Yes, okay. And when she arrives, marking on the territory. Yeah. So that interested me when I was first watching it, because it made me think of, what is, what are you saying about the human dimension of climate change, of crystallization, of course, imperialism, without showing any people, right? Even in the golden moment, there are no people lounging at that pool or eating from the snack tray, or, so I was interested in where you use actual live bodies as opposed to CGI.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that we don't use faces, or we don't want to give a face to Dido, was an intentional decision, because it's a myth, and it's something that is delivered through oral history, and people imagine her in different histories, actually, she appears in different legends, or she might appear in a neighborhood in Rome where she's actually not a street name, but Aeneas, the lover that deprived her, is theirs. And somehow our intention when we went to Tunisia and did that research on Dido was connecting to the water bodies and finding her myth or her struggle in different bodies. And we didn't want to make a difference between landscapes or rivers, because I think our ecological existence or our disconnection with nature is also because there is this separation that we do with natural bodies, and I think we didn't want to make that difference. And we all put them in one line somehow, like the river, the swamplands, and so the intervention that, for example, the swamplands went into these urban development projects that we were mentioning, for example, that they were sold for $1 to Dubai because they wanted to create a big new neighborhood, but then they realized there's too much water in the ground, so they couldn't realize it, for example. Or in the salt desert in the south, in Chott El Djerid, that was supposed to be flooded with the Mediterranean because the French colonizers wanted to change the climate and also create another border to the more resistant southern tribes of Tunisia. And then also connecting it to the Mediterranean that is accused of a lot of violence, being a liquid border, and a liquid graveyard. So somehow our intention was to find Dido and give her many faces, but that are not faces. And I think we are also interested in matter as something that is performing itself, and not us giving a voice to it, or letting it speak by itself somehow.
Well, first of all, thank you, and welcome to Philadelphia as well. Thank you welcome to New Philadelphia, in questions. I'm just very grateful to have you here, for you to be sharing your work with us. So thank you for taking the time and the energy to do that. I guess I'll ask two questions, if I may. One, I wonder if I can just get you to kind of step back a little bit, tell us a little bit about yourselves and kind of how you came together as a kind of partnership, and where the idea for this film came from. I mean, a little bit of the kind of the background to that creative process. I think I'd just be really interested in hearing that. Second question, I'm wondering if there's something specific, there's a message, something specific you're trying to say to us about the Mediterranean in this film. Because I couldn't help but, I kept going back to that as I was watching it. The Mediterranean is a very charged space these days, politically, in terms of migration, as a sort of, it's come to take on this role in recent years as a sort of almost borderland between Europe and not Europe, right? For lack of a better way of putting it. And I think that, and maybe that's just some sort of for where I sit in terms of, you know, my interest in sort of the Middle East, but I couldn't get away from that as I was watching this. And I'm wondering if there's something that you're trying to say to us about the Mediterranean in this film, if that makes sense.
So I answer the first question. So we met at the end of 2019 in Jordan. I was invited to, we did some exchange with an initiative between Berlin and Amman. And I met Areej, and already throughout our first conversations we found a lot of common questions around the use of digital tools, but also kind of different questions around problematic systems, but also finding different approaches towards like more exclusive artistic processes. So, and yeah, it was a very like flow into like already starting working together. So we did a VR work on an abandoned fun park in Amman. And then we continued research in Jordan, Tunisia, Germany, Albania, Poland on like water bodies and landscapes and how they're affected by political transitions. Because I think whenever we did do these contextual research, like more artistic field research, like anything, like a river is always very connected to politics, you know? And I think we're very much interested into this relationship. So, yeah, and then somehow I think, I mean, it's a great luck that we met and that we also were able to continue working together, because I think there's a lot of like possibilities into collaboration. I think we very much believe into collectivity and like working with different people. But because it's enriched by our different perspectives, but also having a common ground as two women coming together and supporting each other in producing, but also in research and complementing each other with our different backgrounds. And also, yeah, I'm based in Germany, Areej is based in Jordan. We live on different sides of the Mediterranean. So I think, yeah, maybe you want to continue with the second question.
Yeah, and also being allowed in collaboration, just on the first question, is also how do you engage in a collaborative work where you allow for unexpected things to unfold, either through the conversation or the field visits or these things. So this is what keeps this going, let's say. But the other question on what are we saying about the Mediterranean, I feel that like when we first wanted to go to Tunisia, we wanted to use the story of Dido as a way to listen to the present, and there's no one story to be told about the Mediterranean or the Mediterraneans, let's say, because there's so many stories about it. But I think one of the main themes is this idea of enforced mutation, enforced change, that affecting different ecological bodies. And in the work, it's about also connecting the Mediterranean to other bodies of water. So in a way, by appropriating the myth of Drexia, of all these people that get, because in the myth of Drexia, of the Atlantic enslavement, all pregnant women were thrown off ships because they were seen as disruptive cargo. So in the myth of Drexel, the babies that were born underwater were imagined that they didn't need oxygen to breathe. So in a way of like understanding the future of the Mediterranean that is imagined in the Shatt al-Jarid, in the like let's say a site that was could mutate in that way, because also the Mediterranean seawater would imagine to like expect it to dry out, and maybe thinking or creating space or allowing ourselves to imagine of a possibility where even in that transformation maybe there is some hope for different territorial understandings of geographies where like all the people that drown in the water could also surface with different abilities for resistance that come from salt, and as a way of still walking in that but having different human abilities, so not needing oxygen to breathe and having a body that is resistant to salt because of these conditions. So it's a bit of a metaphor, but also as an imagination, but also it's a bit bittersweet, let's say. So that's one way of, but then this is one story, but then other stories of, I'm always interested also in what comes out after a discussion, like what people imagine of, and I think this is one of them.
And maybe we can also say that, I mean, the term Mediterraneans comes from the curator work with Chiara Cartuccia, who thinks about the Mediterranean with different realities, and us again engaging with the Mediterranean from very different perspectives and geographies, like let's say also different social realities, you know, like Germany where a lot of people arrive, or Tunisia where a lot of people leave over the Mediterranean. But last year we also did research in Albania, and the Mediterranean becomes a drug traffic route, because it's at the border of Europe and it's a narco state, and after the fall of communism the country went into poverty and then started trading marijuana and now cocaine. And that's why it's a narco state, not part of the EU, because it's, but then the EU or Europe is consuming all the cocaine, let's say. So there's a lot of like different meanings of the Mediterranean or Italy, where it's like a holiday destination for a lot of Europeans, let's say. So yeah, I think that that became very core, even though we both don't like live like in countries that is actually bordering the Mediterranean, but I think that it's very much affecting us at the same time. Yeah.
When you were talking just now about your coming together, it sounded like you were saying that you were coming together over technological interventions in film. And I was really interested in the landscapes that you constructed. And I was, so I wanted to ask you like a nerdy filming question, you know, about that process of making those decisions, about how are you creating particular kind of affective experiences of the coastline, of the pre-Dido moment, of the contemporary moment, and at the end. So you said salt desert earlier, which makes me think it's an actual location where she's running, which I didn't know. But I was going to ask, you know, how do you create a salt set? You know, how did you create some of those visual moments technologically, and how did you make the decisions around when to use the real and when to use the generated?
I mean, in the Dido Problem, for example, we use the tool of digital reenactment to show the myth of Dido, because it's not documented or something, it's an imagination. So we created the palace, for example, and then we reenacted like this moment where she arrives, but then we're also referencing like digital surveillance tools of like border politics, where she's kind of like positioning herself on the map or in this like control system, let's say. And then yeah, the salt desert actually exists. So the Shatt al-Jarid in the south of Tunisia is a dried out sea, most probably. So it's an actual salt desert that we use as a starting point for imagining that. But we have one of our newest work, Rising Up from Highlight, is actually a creation of a salt desert where it's an immersive installation where the viewer is moving through that dried out Mediterranean, and this we created in Cinema 4D, so it's a 3D, 4D software that we're using.
We started using the software during COVID times because all we had is the computer, and also drives a bit crazy because you start understanding your surroundings through surfaces that are empty, because you construct things but then you add light and shadows and material, and so it's really like just working with it really informs, like builds this imaginative approach to, okay, now we use like the decisions to use the reenactment in a digital format, but also creating these blurred realities. So sometimes you don't know if this is actually made or shot, and then maybe the made becomes more real than the real itself, you know. So I think just being in that landscape and learning on a computer with all the frustration that it comes with, because we always talk about it also with Gabby, then you start, I don't know, something happens with that frustration moment, I think.
Yeah, I have to say that we don't worship like digital tools. Like sometimes we are also very much critical towards it. Like for example, virtual reality is something that each time we're deciding to use it, we also question, like, why are we using it? And to not just like celebrate it as something that is like so, like also sometimes headshots in the art world, you know, because if we use it, we really use it as something, okay, we want to invite people into a space that opens up certain imaginations, future imaginations, or it's an intention. So we always like, and then sometimes, yeah, we say like we don't want to use these things because they're so much like far away from human, more organic ways and processes and flows that but at the same time, I think they open up so much possibilities, and I think that they are a great tool sometimes, but I think, yeah, we have a lot of discussions about it.
Yeah, also maybe I'll add something on VR, because the question sometimes is how can you use VR, being aware of its, how now it's being used as an escape kind of realm where you can go and see, okay, this is a better reality, and then you come back here and then you're confronted with the slowness of life or whatever. But then we're thinking, how can it be something that can give a different perspective on this like physical lived experience? And also, how is the body experiencing that realm when it goes and when it comes back, and what are the elements? And I mean, there are also great examples of people in the 90s that created experiences that are about like the embodied and disembodied presence, and how the more embodied you are in it, the more disembodied the experience could be. But then, how can that make you understand today differently? So yeah.
Related question to that, why the text messages? Can you say a bit more about, you have these mythological creatures, or figures from across centuries, communicating with one another through text message.
Yeah, when we researched on Dido, we also found other myths of these female virtues, like Astarte or Dahia. And then we, like Dahia, which is also Algerian kind of female figure and also military leader who burned like fields and gold and silver to protect the land from invaders. Or Astarte, who's also like the goddess of fertility and also nature, and they are all kind of fighting certain oppressive or patriarchal systems, and they're kind of in the same, like fighting the same systems, let's say, or facing the same problems. So we're using, or we imagine them to use like digital communication, bring like a threat to present day communication, and imagining them being in solidarity, women's solidarity as a way to support each other, but also being in the same position, or being in the same situation, or yeah.
They were at different times, So, yeah, so just to bring the struggle to the present and say that it's not something new. Like all these problems are structural problems, and they're like, did you hear about write and what you want? So they're like, like all these things, and using text messages to make it a bit more accessible, and it's like a conversation anyone can have about other struggles as well.
No, I loved that device, and I read it as a real kind of feminist reworking of these relationships across time and these kind of conundrums. I really liked that, and I was just going to go back for a second to the digital landscape and the, to create those landscapes takes so much time, as you're saying, having just done a very little bit of it myself. And when is the light just right? When is the movement the right speed? When do the waves have to lap in a particular kind of way? So I found it really powerful the way that you used it, because throughout the film you keep us in this kind of surreal affective state. So it's not a gimmick, it's not a trick, it's like there's not a ton of differentiation between the constructed world and the real landscape, and I thought, I really appreciated that. I thought you did that very, very nicely. And then, of course, the one sort of super real moment is the very beginning. And I have to say, I'm still like stumped by it. And, I've watched it several times. I was like, what is Dido doing in the market? And how are people encountering her? Like, do they know what they're encountering? Like, what do they think they're seeing? And she goes behind the screen one time to find out, wait, is somebody really behind her talking? And and then of course the person who's pouring tea, I was like, what would it mean to pour tea for Dido and for her to say bless you? So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that beginning and what you wanted it to do in terms of setting up the historical story. And partly that's because I don't know the extent to which sort of people today are familiar with the myth. Maybe it's not bizarre to encounter Dido in the market, actually. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, so that was during the residency that we did in Tunisia. So we spent 3 months in Tunisia with the question, like, how do we find Dido in the present? And then we constructed the structure with a collective design studio called Al-Warsha. And it was a way for us to talk to people about Dido, basically, and try to find her in the present. And then, because we realized after this that people know Dido but don't necessarily remember her, so we have this structure that roams in Al-Madina, but the voice is not visible, because also the technology gives more anonymity, so people were more willing to talk about Dido as a starting point to talk about desire or to talk about other things. So sometimes people say, actually I saw her walking there, and then she was wearing white, and some other would be like, when you see her, tell her this, and so she became in the city, but also she became in other stories. So in the story of Mira, and the one that was wearing white in the film, she has a similar story to Dido of the struggle of like being confronted by all this, let's say, masculine oppression. And also Saeed al-Khadra was like a popular dancer that stopped dancing for 12 years, and then in the film she was dancing, and when she was born, and then there was earthquake, and so finding Dido in other stories and bringing her into the city, and then hearing about like the other female virtues that were mentioned, like the Hiya al-Kahna was, people were saying, okay, but why are you talking about Dido? What about the Hiya al-Kahna or all these other? So it was a way to bring her into the present and have a conversation and open up a space to desire.
Pollution plays a big role in this film, right? The water is visibly dirty at various points, and you've spent some time here in Philadelphia now, looking at various water features. I understand you've been checking out some long-buried creeks and things like that, right? I mean, reflected in your time here on, have you made sort of forged interesting connections in your minds between our own experiences here with water pollution, either historical or contemporary, in the film?
I mean, we went on an amazing tour with lovely Adam, who's here as well. And it's still very fresh, so it's difficult to have a concrete parallel, let's say. But, and also during the workshop and all the conversation that we had, what was very present is how the molecules of water, let's say, still carry all these things, but how let's say, state response to these things is often to ignore the bones and ignore the remains and ruins and ignore the ghosts that are affected so much by violence that is carried within the water. So on the tour where we went to trace the Mill Creek, there was a part where we were told about how water used to carry a lot of black coal, and how from the coal dust that was still carried in the water, like a sewage system was built, and then houses were built on top, and then at one point everything fell in the water again. So the violence and how that still affects today's structure was like the main thing. So the question maybe that was very present with us is how do states respond to these to ghosts that linger under the water, but ghosts in a way that are invisible, you know, but they're still affected, they still linger today.
I think, for the workshop we're reading also about the Schuylkill River, and I mean, it's wherever you go and whatever river you encounter, you find those stories about pollution and human intervention, in this case about mining, anthracite mining, and all the leftovers that were channeled, like tons of crazy toxic matter that went into that, and that made the river so like filled with toxicity that it was sometimes burning like a river on fire, which is something that is also a crazy imagination, right? And then all those different names that were given to it, you know, like the native tribe gave it like an original name, but then the colonizers, and it's also always the story of colonization usually, like how our rivers transformed and changed and also affected by colonialism. And I think when we talk about water, like we talk about these things over those rivers, but it's interesting, like even though we're just having a quick research because we're not, as Areej said, so long here, but I think it's a similar story.